Westside.
Good morning.
It is, as always, good to see you here on Sunday mornings. Thank you for being here, and thank you for making Sundays at Westside important enough to take the time and to make the effort to be here as often as you possibly can. Our responsive reading this morning was written by Mary Oliver. Oliver is a prolific poet. She's won the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize for her writing. The New York Times has said she is far and away America's best-selling poet. Many of her works have been published by Beacon Press, the Unitarian Universalist publishing company made famous in some ways when it decided to publish the Pentagon Papers decades ago. The Pentagon Papers brought to light the discrepancies in the Vietnam War reality and the Johnson administration's vision of what the truth was during that engagement. If you are interested, there is a phenomenal story on the Democracy Now! Website of how Beacon Press came to publish the Pentagon Papers and the resultant harassment, intimidation, and the possibility of criminal persecution that came from publication of the truth. There are times, unfortunately, when truth-telling exacts a price. But Mary Oliver's morning poem, our responsive reading, is a long way from the troubling details of Vietnam. It is, in my opinion, a light and cheerful poem which uses bright language and, I believe, speaks to a human being's ability to be both positive and negative in life. If it is your nature to be happy, she says, you will swim away along the soft trails for hours, your imagination alighting everywhere. And she goes on, if your spirit carries within it the thorn that is heavier than lead, if it's all you can do to keep on trudging, there is still somewhere deep within you a beast shouting that the earth is exactly what it wanted. We can, it seems, go both ways in our thoughts. Thoughts that help us see the world in a positive light, and at other times, see the world in ways that are less than encouraging. The comforting thing is, from my perspective, that we can have a great deal of input as to how we will choose to view the world and our life within it. Now, there are a few of you here who know my father, but if you did, you would know he is practically compulsively positive in manner and demeanor. He's a quiet, bookish man who often turns inward to examine his thoughts. He is incredibly optimistic, sometimes annoyingly so. I can remember when a brother-in-law of mine had been in a terrible accident. His larger-than-large Dodge truck had been crushed by another truck on one of the back roads of Johnson County, where a young driver was traveling way too fast and lost control of his vehicle. The young driver's truck smashed into my brother-in-law's truck, and it left both drivers in pretty bad shape. CareFlight was called to save my brother-in-law's life, and all of my family rushed to the hospital from our different locations to see what would happen and to comfort my sister and to see if her husband would survive. As we waited in the emergency room, my father seemed to unconsciously go from person to person and reassure everyone that his son-in-law would pull through and be fine. He had nothing on which to base this assessment. He had no medical training or knowledge. He'd not even seen my brother-in-law, didn't know how beat up he was from the accident. But my father just instinctively defaulted into an optimistic attitude of the situation. I've seen him do this many times before. He did the same thing when I had cancer as a boy. He did the same thing when my mother was ill. Whenever one of his offspring was having difficulty in life, he promised everything would be all right. As I said, I found this habit of my father, this eternal optimism, to be fairly annoying. To promise a positive outcome when he had little to base this prediction upon seemed almost irresponsible to me. But as I look back on life, my father was practically always right. My brother-in-law made it through the accident, recovered with little more than a bit of a limp. I recovered from cancer twice. My mother made it through her health crises, and my sisters made it through their respective challenges. Dad was right. My mother, whom I love, but would not necessarily classify as overly optimistic, would sometimes say to my father, "Stop being so Pollyanna." I remember hearing this when I was young, but at the time I didn't know what "stop being so Pollyanna" meant. Yet I could definitely tell by my mother's tone that being Pollyanna was not viewed by her to be an overly attractive characteristic. Pollyanna was a fictional character created by author Eleanor Porter in a book titled with the same name and published in 1913. A sequel would follow 2 years later titled Pollyanna Grows Up. 11 more Pollyanna books would be produced by other authors, and the original book has been adapted to film several times. The most popular was probably the Walt Disney version of 1960. In the book and in the movie, young Pollyanna Whittier goes to live with her aunt in Vermont. Her aunt is well-to-do, but is a taskmaster, and not all that happy about life in general, almost like my own mother. When even younger, before being taken to live with her aunt, Pollyanna's father taught her something called the glad game, in which the idea was to find something positive, something to be glad about in every situation. The young girl's very good at the game, to the point where others are, at first, put off by her ability. They are annoyed by Pollyanna's optimism. Later, however, Pollyanna's knack of finding something to be glad about in every situation begins to rub off on those who know her and who come into contact with her. In some ways, she teaches others how to play the game, how to be glad about something in every situation. And subsequently, this little town in Vermont is changed. Even her aunt, who strongly resists initially, is also influenced by the ability of the young girl to be glad, to be happy about something in every situation. Yet even Pollyanna is tested eventually. She's hit by a car, and the accident results in the loss of the use of her legs. She's relegated to her bed, and she is unable to find anything to be glad about in this new situation initially. Then the townspeople flood her aunt's home with visits to tell her how Pollyanna's spirit has influenced them individually and how their lives are better because of this young girl's optimism. The story ends with Pollyanna being sent to a hospital where she learns to walk again The appreciation for her legs and the ability to walk only serves to increase her positive attitude, and she is even more thankful, more optimistic than she was before the accident. Optimism is something I believe we can learn to increase. We can learn to see good things even when things don't look so good. I recently read a little story where a traveler came upon an old farmer hoeing in his field beside the road. Eager to rest his feet, the wanderer hailed the countryman, who seemed happy enough to straighten his back and talk for a moment. "What sort of people live in the next town?" asked the stranger. "Well, what were the people like where you've come from?" replied the farmer, answering the question with another question. "Now, they were a bad lot. Troublemakers all, and lazy too. The most selfish people in the world, and not one of them to be trusted. I'm happy to be leaving the scoundrels." "Is that so?" replied the farmer. "Well, I'm afraid you'll find the same sort in the next town." Disappointed, the traveler trudged on his way, and the farmer returned to his work. Sometime later, another stranger, coming from the same direction, hailed the farmer, and they stopped to talk. "What sort of people live in the next town?" he asked. "What were the people like where you come from?" replied the farmer once again. "They were the best people in the world. Hard-working, honest, and friendly. I'm sorry to be leaving them." "Fear not," said the farmer. "You'll find the same sort in the next town." We are, or at least can be, very influential in our outlook on life. We will see what we are conditioned to see, and we can condition ourselves to see good things. I'm a firm believer in our ability to, in some very real ways, manifest reality out of what we believe. It's difficult sometimes, and we're not always successful with all things. For instance, I have often seen signs at sporting events that a fan holds up that says, "We believe," only to see their team lose. And just because a parent believes her child to be an individual who can do no wrong does not make that so. You may have seen where the parents of the Boston Marathon bombing suspects are unable to comprehend the possibility that their children could have done something so heinous. But here's the good news. We all have a little bit of Pollyanna in us. Some of us admittedly more than others, but virtually all of us, even the grumpiest of our friends, has the propensity to be positive, to be optimistic, to play the glad game, where we see the good in situations that don't always seem so good. We're mostly optimistic about ourselves. Most of us believe we are above average drivers. In fact, a study I read demonstrated that 93% of us who drive believe ourselves to be of above average skill, a statistical impossibility. We also, more often than not, believe our affectional relationships to be better than our peers. And in a study of MBA students at Stanford University, 87% believe themselves to be in the top 25% of their class. Similarly, almost 70% of professors at the University of Nebraska believe themselves to be in the top 25% of teachers. We tend to see our own abilities as better than most, as above average. A sort of Garrison Keillor, Lake Wobegon of that. as some have called it, where all of the children are above average. We will often downplay behaviors that are not in our best interest. People almost always underreport the amount of alcohol they drink. Young people will underreport their less than safe sexual practices. We'll often downplay our health issues as less serious than they really are. It is, at its most basic level, a strategy of survival. A researcher at University College London calls this the optimism bias. And in her book, titled The Optimism Bias, a tour of the irrationally positive brain, she says the optimism bias protects us from accurately perceiving the pain and difficulties the future undoubtedly holds. And it may defend us from viewing our options in life as somewhat limited. As a result, stress and anxiety are reduced, physical and mental health are improved, and the motivation to act and be productive is enhanced. In order to progress, we need to be able to imagine alternative realities, not just any old reality, but better ones. And we need to believe them to be possible. We have, I believe, evolved to seek out the positive in life. It's good for us. It helps us get past many of the times when life basically sucks. Helping us see a future that is brighter and more livable. Our ability to adapt, to see the optimistic outcome, helps us get through those hard times and do so in a way that holds out hope and allows us to carry on. The author of The Optimism Bias says, humans are hugely affected by the expectations placed upon them. Your employee will be more productive if you expect him to be. Your spouse will be more loving if you anticipate her to be. Your child will be more likely to do well if you hold her sports and her school to be highly talented. Even teenagers' alcohol consumption has been shown to be influenced by parental expectations. We are typically so optimistic that we will convince ourselves the lesser of two evils ain't so bad. In an experiment conducted by university researchers, people were asked to choose between two items, two situations, neither of which were especially pleasant. The author of The Optimism Bias explains a study where a volunteer named Stuart was asked to choose between having herpes or having fleas. She writes, after selecting one adverse event over the other, let's say Stuart picked fleas over herpes, a participant would rate the selected condition, the fleas, as less severe than he had before, and the rejected option, herpes, as worse. Although both options may have seemed severe at first glance, by reevaluating the condition he selected and viewing it in a positive light, Stuart experienced a heightened sense of well-being, because even the lesser of two evils was able to be rerouted into something more positive. We can even make out having fleas as being more positive. Even as difficult as life can be, we have the ability to be incredibly optimistic. We may not be as trusting that everything will turn out all right like my father. We may not all have the poetical promise of Mary Oliver. We may not all be Pollyannas to the extent that we are able to find the good in each and every situation. But we can choose, as suggested by Monty Python, to always look on the bright side of life. possibly situations that may just be unbearable, and we'll be forced to determine for ourselves what these situations are and how we will respond to them, knowing full well our response may be very different than what our friends and family would like. But most of us, in most situations, most of the time, will be able to find the good in just about any circumstance in which we find ourselves. It is our default, and it has helped our species tremendously in our survival. So, I hope you start this week in a positive light. Choose to be happy. Choose to be positive. Our life can be a dance if we allow it to be, if we choose it to be. Sometimes with missteps and miscues, but for the most part, a whole lot of fun. And that fun is multiplied when we are in a community of others who choose to do the same thing. As we rise in body or spirit and join in singing our closing hymn number 311, Let It Be a Dance,